Hi, podcast listeners. Welcome to the A World of Difference podcast. We have so many guests on this show making a difference in our lives, making a difference all around the world with the expertise that they bring. And yet so many of you are reaching out to me saying, you want more. It's not enough just what we're putting on these podcast episodes for you. And so I am here to extend a very warm welcome to you to our Difference Maker community, where you can join for as little as $5 a month to get all this extra content. Out the gate, you're going to get 30 plus mini-sodes of exclusive content not available for the regular podcast listeners, and an exclusive mini-sode every month. And you'll get exclusive voting power to help us pick podcast topics and more. And that's at our Changers tier. There's 3 different main tiers and then an extra larger tier. But whatever tier that you join at, you will be included in this extra content. And I know that many of you are wanting to go a little bit deeper. And so even though it gets a little wild in there sometimes because of how deep we go, I want you to join us there. This extra content is very special. It means a great deal to me to be a part of this community with you. And I would love to just exchange ideas or perspectives that you have around these different episodes. And that's the place where we do it. So please show up to our Difference Maker community. Give us $5 out of your pocket every month. And I think that you'll have a lot of fun in there because we do. And I would love for you to join us. So go to patreon.com/A World of Difference to join us there. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the A World of Difference podcast. I'm your hostess, Lori Adams Brown, and this is our immigration series. Welcome to episode 8. If you're thinking of starting a podcast, I recommend Anchor. And I also recommend starting a podcast because it's tons of fun. Anchor has been a great place for me getting started because it's free. They have creation tools that basically let you record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. They distribute it basically everywhere for you. And you've basically got all you need to make a podcast just right in one place. So go to the Anchor app or anchor.fm to get started. My guest today is Lisa Rodriguez-Watson. She's a friend I met many years ago, maybe 20-something years ago, when we were getting our master's degrees in Northern California. And she is just an amazing thought leader. She was recently named the National Director for Missio Alliance. And if you're not familiar with that organization, please look it up. They are just an organization that helps the church in the United States and all of North America work through some of the current issues facing our society. She's very passionate about biblical justice. She's going to obviously talk to us today about immigration. She is the daughter of a Cuban American immigrant, and I'm sure she'll dig into that part of her story. She has lived among and loved immigrants in many parts of the world. In Fresno, California for a while, she and her husband, Matt, are currently in the DC area. Both pastors in the area at the same church, and just, on a daily basis, and how it is in urban America, just encountering all kinds of different immigrants from different countries around the world. But she's also lived abroad a few times. She lived in Africa for a while with her family, and she also, earlier in life, lived in Albania and worked with refugees during that time. So she brings a lot of passion to this conversation, both on a personal level with her own family and also just for those that she knows. But in particular, she's going to help us dig into some of the reasons her faith is a really huge part of why she feels compelled to be an advocate and a voice for immigrants here in the United States of America and in other parts of the world. You are in for such a treat today. She's just an amazing person, very articulate, so pay attention, take notes, and I'm sure she'll point you to some great resources that you can look up after this show. Welcome to the show, Lisa Rodriguez-Watson. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Lori.
Thanks for being on our show today. I really appreciate it.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Well, we're doing this immigration series, and when I think about immigration, I think about you because I know that you have been very active in this whole conversation, and you're a really great thought leader in this area. And you've been a real advocate for immigrants, both in the U.S. and globally in different ways. So why don't you give a little introduction to yourself, who you are, and what you do?
Sure. Thank you. So I currently live in Washington, D.C., and I am on the pastoral staff team of Christ City Church. My everyday job, I have the privilege of being the national director of Missio Alliance, which is a new role for me, and I'm loving it. Let's see. I am the daughter of a Cuban immigrant. My dad came to the United States when he was 10 back in 1961. And so this sort of connects with me personally as part of my story. I grew up bicultural, biracial. And so it matters to me in those ways.
Yeah, I love it because I think that it's so important to hear the stories of a second generation immigrant and how that's impacted your life and the lives of so many here in the United States. And I know that you also spent some time abroad. So I'd love for you to talk about how you have found yourself being an advocate for immigrants here in the U.S. and globally, and maybe even just describe in your own words what's going on with immigration at the moment.
Yeah, sure. I think I'll start, I guess maybe chronologically, besides the fact that I'm the daughter of an immigrant family. When I was called into ministry a number of years ago, I spent a summer in Albania during the Kosovo crisis, I guess is what they would call it. And it was then that I worked with refugees that had left Yugoslavia, had left Kosovo, and were in Albania. So I was actually in Albania doing work with refugees. And it was such a profound time. I hadn't ever done anything like that. I had spent some time abroad, but had never really worked directly with refugees in crisis situations like that. And, what a privilege to get to be a part of the story of families who are in the worst circumstances of their life, and to be able to provide a little bit of relief. And actually what was wonderful for me was I was able to come alongside and work with Kosovar refugees who were serving their own communities. And I was just like a warehouse hand, go get me a box of diapers, go get, we need 3 packs of this. And I was able to just kind of come alongside the work that they were doing for their own people. I heard stories of families that, tragic loss, unfathomable pain, and came away thinking, well, when the country opens back up, which it did during the course of my time in Albania, when Kosovo opens back up, I want to spend a couple of years there, and I want to be a part of the rebuilding. However that can happen as an American in a non-American context, and just go and support the story of rebuilding in any way that I can. So that was kind of my first intersection abroad with refugees, coming back to the States. And then I began to do some development of sort of like my own ethnic identity in new ways. Being bicultural and biracial, it's not uncommon to hear stories of, well, you do fit into 2 cultures, but you don't fit into either one of those perfectly. Mm-hmm. And certainly that was part of the experience that I had. So I began to really just ask the Lord, what you have made me for what reasons? There are 1,000 things that are unique about me. Certainly being the daughter of a Cuban immigrant is one of them. Why? What's the significance of that? And is there a unique way that I can contribute? That was part of during a time when I was actually living alongside lots of immigrants in the Central Valley of California. And so there was this intersection of my own ethnic identity development, and then this question of, what does the Bible have to say about how we're to care for immigrants? And as I began to explore that, and ask hard questions about what's life like on the farms, how do families sustain? Because I was running a tutoring program for children in my community at the time, and their parents and their aunts and uncles were on the farms working, and they would, and they just kind of had to figure life out. They had guardians for sure, but the support in their homes was different than what I grew up with, for sure. And I began to really wonder, what does the Bible have to say about how we're to care for immigrants? And that began me on the journey, really, of why I care about immigration. Because what I discovered was there's this beautiful meta-narrative. Nicholas Wolterstorff has coined this phrase, the quartet of the oppressed. And we see so many times throughout the scriptures that God says to care for the widow, the poor, the orphan, and the stranger, or the alien, or the immigrant. And so I really found just this new story that God was telling of how to care for his people and how to live faithfully for justice in the scriptures in a way that I just somehow hadn't seen previously.
It's so beautiful. And I love that right off the bat, you're bringing in how your faith has impacted your desire to work with immigrants and be an advocate for them, and how so much of your own story plays into it. And I do think that those commands to care for the immigrant are there for a really particular reason, and multiple reasons. And I think some of those reasons are, if we could shift our minds to thinking about it, would be along the lines of what we have to benefit in a nation where we get to receive them. So I would love for you to talk some about what are some areas that you have found to be beneficial for your own life about welcoming immigrants, whether they're Cuban American like your family or from other places. How has your life been personally enriched by immigrants?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think before I jump into the answer on that, Lori, I think if you don't mind me just saying, so many times, immigration, it can tend to be a political debate in our country. And oftentimes, even in the faith communities and Christian contexts, which is my primary context, we find that it's not, the conversation is actually not that different, sadly, from the conversation that's happening in the rest of the world. Because what people want to really talk about is, what's it going to cost us? What's it going to cost us? And we forget to ask the most important question of, what are the benefits? And so I'm so glad that you start with that question, because it's significant, and there are so many benefits to having immigrants in our lives. For me personally, there's this beautiful reminder of joy that I get when I'm around immigrants. There's this it's just a beautifully pronounced gratitude, a sense of gratitude for the opportunities, for the things that I would perceive as really difficult, and certainly that are difficult for them. There is still this sense of it's not entitled. There's no entitlement there. Yeah. There is a beauty of man, I'm just grateful to be here. I'm grateful for the opportunities that I have. I'll tell a story. My grandmother, I was having a conversation with her one day, and her youngest sister had worked for the Cuban government, and then eventually decided to defect. So we were sharing the story of how that happened and what was going on. And I said, Abuela, so she just left her neighborhood one day and acted as if she would be back from a work trip. And she just left and never came back. She couldn't have taken anything with her but a suitcase. Yeah. And she said, Lisa, that's every single one of us. Wow. We all came with just a suitcase. And, I don't know why had I not thought of that? It somehow struck me, but that's the story of my family. And yet there's never been a time where they have just said, gosh, I regret being here. I regret the decision to come. There's always this profound thankfulness and and a spirit of generosity, even more than thankfulness. It's a spirit of generosity that I think, boy, we would do well to learn from, as North Americans, as Americans. And I think that's probably the one thing that I think of that comes to my mind, is just a joy and a generosity of spirit.
So when you think of an immigrant, how would you sort of like sum that up in like your thoughts about an immigrant? I know there's a lot of, like you said, it's very politicized in the U.S. and even, places in Europe and Australia and other places at the moment where there's sort of this, political conversation around immigrants, and people may have a variety of concepts of what that means. But for you personally, when you think of an immigrant, what do you think of?
Yeah, I think, there are quite a lot of categories politically of immigrants. There's refugees, and then there's immigrants, and there's asylees, and there's all kinds of statuses and types of immigrants. The most basic definition, I think, is someone who has come from a country into a country not their own. And I think that's that captures all of the different types of immigrants. I don't know if it's the answer you were looking for, but that's what I think of is, it doesn't matter what way necessarily, what way they come. Do they come as an asylee? Do they come as a political refugee or any kind of refugee? But they come from a place for some reason that usually has to do with tremendous hardship into a place where they are looking for new opportunity, for something greater, either for themselves or for their families. And I think that's, that is the other thing that's so common among the immigrant story, is it's either trying to just escape a life and death situation, or trying to create a new beginning for themselves and for their families. Most of the people that I have come across, either at the border or in my neighborhoods, and even my own family story, it was the life that we had where we come from was not sustainable. Mm-hmm. And we've got to have some other opportunity to live a life that includes flourishing, not just survival or, the worst option of death.
Yeah. It's just a reminder, like when you gave your definition of immigrant, and how broad that is. Anytime we walk under an immigration sign in an airport, we're some version of an immigrant, whether we're calling ourselves an expat and it sounds a little more fancy, or whether we're trying to get there by any means possible because of the desperation that we feel, and maybe on a boat that wasn't the best journey across an ocean that was pretty scary, and we're just lucky to be alive reaching ashore. And just the way in the United States, even Puritans came on a dangerous journey to arrive here in a land that wasn't their own. So if we're not full-blooded Native American in the U.S., most of us have a story of immigration either recently or a few generations back in our families. And I think that's a really good reminder. And in light of that, you talked about the different ways that people can immigrate, at least into the United States. We have our system allows for H-1B visas, like what we have here, like in Sunnyvale. There's a lot of people in tech on the H-1B visa, which has currently been in the news because of the current administration trying to change some of that. You can come in through like a spouse visa, a student visa, which also was recently in jeopardy at the beginning of this fall semester for a lot of different students at Stanford and in different places around here. There's asylum seekers. There's just so many ways, at least in the United States, to immigrate. And so I'd love for you to share your thoughts on just our current immigration policies and processes and what you think about that.
Yeah, I lament the ways that this administration has handled refugees, immigrants, a variety of statuses of immigrants. And you're exactly right. I mean, even students didn't know what their status was going to be. I have a friend, in fact, who lives here in the city, and she was here on a work visa and is trying to get a student visa. And because of all of the upheaval, she's likely to have to return to Madagascar. And she doesn't have any roots in Madagascar. It just happens to be where her family was from.
Wow.
And it's devastating. It's absolutely devastating. The ridiculous cutback on the number of refugees that we're allowing into our country. You know, Lori, I'm not going to pull any punches. I just think it's shameful that we've chosen to move in this direction. We have the resources. There is, without question, the refugee program is one of the safest. We can afford it. We have space for it. You know, it's like refugees who come into the country are very, 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 very low in terms of committing crimes. Like there is no reason really why we should cut back that program so severely. So I think how we've then now with a new border process and a new border status, you're not allowed to come anymore and claim asylum and be let into the country. Now you have to wait on the other side of the border, which is putting people in such dangerous situations. I've been on the other side of the border and have seen these folks who are waiting for a court date, and they're just living in whatever way they can. And some of them are intense. Some of them have more permanent or semi-permanent housing opportunities, but it's different all along the border. I was just in one city. And so I think it's a tragedy. We really do have the opportunity to create a system that works for everybody, that works for our economy, that works for our communities, and that works for our neighbors and our neighbors to the south of the border. And I do think it's a tragedy. It's a missed opportunity for us to have some of the greatest minds in the world come to our country on the H-1B visas. It's a missed opportunity to have the kind of labor that would help our market flourish. And it's a missed opportunity to practice hospitality and to be generous.
Yeah.
So it's pretty tragic.
Yeah, I agree. And as somebody who's been so welcomed as an immigrant in so many nations throughout most of my 45 years, I also find it very shameful and a huge missed opportunity. I myself, I just agree with you. I think immigrants add a lot to my life here in the Silicon Valley. Most people that I know are either first or second generation immigrant here, and they just are. I love all the different cultures and languages and foods and all the many things that come along with immigration in a place that's an urban environment where you can just see it like all the nations on display. It just reminds me a little bit of heaven, and I just really personally enjoy it. And even the diversity within the, socioeconomic situations. Like I grew up around a lot of poverty in Venezuela, and it's certainly gotten worse even since, the 80s and 90s when I was growing up there. But I learned some of my best life lessons from people who were hustling and trying to make life work and being resilient and creative and innovative in the midst of poverty. And I wouldn't trade any of that. My faith is stronger because of that. And I know a lot of our immigrants are evangelical Christians that are coming to the U.S., a large percentage of them, and they just add so much to our churches and our faith communities. And I just personally really benefit from seeing the journeys. Like I hear the journeys of what people have gone through, especially some of the more recent ones. And there's always a really hard story when it comes to, like you said, immigration. If people have left, it's for a reason. Even if somebody on an H-1B visa that just, was living in a family where they just couldn't be free to be themselves, and they wanted to come to America and sort of make some more of their own choices. Even that in itself was a situation that for them wasn't sustainable. And you get inspired when you see people be that courageous and take those kind of risks. It helps us want to take risks when they're presented to us as well, and know that we can be strong because we can kind of borrow faith from other people. And immigrants are certainly the kind of people I've borrowed a lot of faith from in different times. So I just would like to know, in a practical way, what are some of the areas that you are trying to be either an advocate for immigrants or just do work on behalf of them, just on a personal level? And then after that, I'd love for you to speak more on if there's any kind of systemic level that you would like, are involved in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've found that I want to follow the immigrants who are empowered and are doing the work themselves. Immigrants actually, they have the answers that their community needs. What they need are allies to come alongside and to help amplify their message. And so I've found that instead of creating something new, that I come alongside their work and just support them in the ways that I can when I'm asked. I have a dear friend, Claudette, and she's a DACA recipient. And so anytime, she says, oh, I'm going to be doing this thing, then I'll be sure to join her. And then I invite my friends, because the truth of it is that in evangelical Christian circles, it has not been very common for us to actually engage in the political process. Yeah. I think, especially in my own story, I was encouraged not to, in fact. Politics, church and state, they shouldn't go together. And it wasn't until I really began to do that work of digging into what the Bible had to say and understanding who I was made to be and what my unique space in this world was, that I realized, oh, if I'm actually going to love my neighbor, then I need to be engaging on this issue. That's what it looks like, because they're flourishing because they don't necessarily have citizenship. They don't have, legal status in our country. And so if they're going to be able to experience the full flourishing that I can experience, I've got to address those systemic issues. And that is not a natural thing for me. I just am just going to say that. It took me a very long time to become comfortable with engaging power and engaging political process. Yeah. It still doesn't feel like, oh, well, I was born to do this. Right. But that doesn't matter. What does matter is loving my neighbor, is loving the immigrants in my community and standing with them. And beginning to really do the work of justice, which matters so much to God. So I do love to follow the lead of my friends who are immigrants and join them in the work that they're doing. And if they're not engaged, years ago when I lived in Memphis, I organized a fasting event, and there were some moms in my community who, were just like, oh, well, I haven't done this. And, and there was another woman that I was working with from the immigrant community. So she was really doing it. But, these women, they just, boy, we haven't fasted in so long, but we're going to do this because it's for our children. It matters for our children. And so getting to, to get to be on the journey with those women, with, young people from across the country who are wanting to continue to stay, to have status, legal status within our country. I just think, I want to be about that work, however I can support it. Did you ask in terms of practical? Yeah. Well, right now, to my knowledge, there's not really anything in the House or the Senate to be proactive on. I think especially in the last 4 years, everything has largely been try and prevent things from getting worse instead of making things better. Yeah. But there's nothing really in the political process right now that I am aware of that we can get on board with. And I haven't had anything come through sort of in terms of briefings in quite some time. So I may not be 100% accurate on that, but I would say, even if it's not at the federal level, like what's going on locally, like in your own communities, find out, especially during pandemic, what are the ESL resources that are available to your immigrant families through the schools? Because that's one way to really be able to have an impact for families in communities. If those resources aren't there, of course, then children fall behind. And as they fall behind, it's just the outcomes are so much harder. So even if there's nothing happening federally at the moment, then I would say, be sure to check on your local and state levels and see what are some ways that you can support the work of immigrants. Yeah.
That's awesome. I love that. And it does give us hope that at some point there will be something we can put our our voices behind. And it's a reminder to keep praying for those who are in the positions of power, just to have open hearts, right? And soft hearts.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, that's like a huge part of the work. I would say that's one of the big lessons I learned living in Asia, when, presidents and politics and different things didn't quite go the direction that would have been helpful. That prayer can do amazing things, and we can always do that, right?
For sure. And I would say, engaging the political process is not just a political thing. It's a spiritual thing. And that's one thing that I've learned along the way, right? Is so many of our representatives, congressional or in the House, they claim to be followers of Jesus. And so it's an opportunity for those of us who are Christians to say, your faith compels you to care for the immigrants. And when I walk the halls of any of the buildings here in DC, getting ready to meet with a political representative, it's a matter of prayer. I pray before I go in. I pray. I ask the staff, would you like me to pray for you? And then we pray when we leave, because this is the work of God. This is not just a political event or a political meeting. This is what God is. It's about what God is at work doing. So it's such an important thing to remember. And just because you're in the halls of power doesn't mean you know that God is not already there doing the work.
Yeah, absolutely. I've heard those same things from other people I know that are also advocating within the ranks of our U.S. government along these lines, that so many of our representatives in Congress are, in fact, people of faith, and that when we encounter people who have our same faith, then we can certainly quote our own scriptures and remind them and encourage them to follow what we all believe and to be true, to love our neighbor well, and the verses that you were talking about earlier about caring for immigrants. And there's a lot of commands in scripture, if we would just pay attention, that would actually make you tremble if you really took them seriously, that we really are commanded to take care of them. And so I think that you're doing that in such a beautiful way. So this whole conversation just leads me to this question that I would love for you to answer. And it's something I've observed. I'm just going to say personal experience, so it could be completely off base, being in the U.S. for the last year. And that is, especially as I've been involved in spaces around the racial reconciliation conversation since the George Floyd situation, one of my observations that I've noticed is the conversation about separation of church and state is much more prominent in the white evangelical spaces that I've been in. And it's much less strict, and the boundaries are a lot less strict in some of the other not majority spaces that I've been in. And so I think it's a lot of it along the lines of, like, is there a difference between, for example, biblical justice and social justice, or are they the same? Are those words interchangeable? Because when it comes to engaging politics and the state, that there is a space for biblical justice or social justice to be involved as people of faith. Whereas I think in the maybe dominant culture, some things about immigration don't feel very personal. And maybe some things about, what happened with George Floyd don't feel as personal to some of the white evangelicals. So what would you say to someone who might be listening to our podcast today that may be a white evangelical and has just been like, separation of church and state, you shouldn't preach on it, you shouldn't talk about it, you shouldn't get involved in it, when it comes to especially the area of immigration?
Yeah, I think, I would first say, could you just suspend judgment, maybe just for a minute, and how, like, let's consider together, how do we reconcile the scriptures of caring for the immigrants? If God has commanded us to do that, then what does that mean? And beyond maybe just having a clothes closet or teaching ESL in individual and interpersonal ways. I mentioned before, really being able to contribute to the whole flourishing, especially for folks who are undocumented. It requires engagement of what prohibits them from that flourishing, and that is their status. And so and I would encourage folks who maybe just feel like it has nothing to do with my everyday life to make a friend who is an immigrant, and really walk with that person and find out. I think it's so easy to allow it to be about an issue when we don't have people in our lives who are directly impacted by that. So it starts with relationship. Often it starts with relationship. And so I would encourage your listeners, anybody who feels so disconnected and just doesn't understand why we've got to engage, to build relationships. And then, really grapple with the scriptures. Certainly we've got to be faithful to the words of God as followers of the Christian faith. And so what does that mean for you, and how do we do that? And then, I think the difference you brought up and mentioned between racial justice and social justice, not racial justice and social justice, biblical justice and social justice. I am pretty careful to use the words biblical justice, because I think that, well, at least from where I'm coming from, the reason why I do the work that I do, the reason why I engage in justice, is because my understanding of the scriptures is that God is a God of justice. And so in order to follow that God, I get to be about doing the things that are just according to the scriptures. And I feel like that's a privilege. And I think in white evangelical spaces, we talk so often, we're very, very, very fluent, and sometimes uncomfortably so with how we steward things, like, oh, well, you have to steward your money, and you have to steward your time, and you have to, that stewardship language is pretty familiar to us. And I think that sometimes we forget to ask the question, how do I steward my citizenship? When I was challenged to think about that, what does it mean for me to steward my citizenship? It kind of revolutionized, like, it was like, oh, right, that's another thing that I get to steward. And I can steward that citizenship on behalf of folks on the underside of power, on behalf of immigrants, on behalf of those who are marginalized in our country. And often I do, because that's part of the way that I seek justice. That's part of the way that I influence the system, is to use my citizenship on behalf of the ones that God cares so deeply about.
That's so good. I'm going to remember that one. And it's definitely just along the lines of the conversation, that some find a little bit controversial, which is the concept that anyone has privilege, right? So I think that, I was one of my undergraduate degrees was a sociology degree, and we definitely kind of talked about the haves and the have-nots, and that's like kind of main part of certain social theory. And I know a lot of it is very much in the conversation in America right now, but I think if we're all being honest, there are some levels of that we all carry, and I think a lot of America would agree that it is a privilege to have a U.S. passport, to be a U.S. citizen. But I don't think very many of us have asked the question, what therefore does that mean now for me? Because, with this kind of privilege comes a responsibility to be a blessing, not just to be blessed, right? Especially if you're a person of faith. That's a concept we find throughout Scripture. We find it in Genesis 12 when, God tells Abraham that he's blessing him to be a blessing, and through him all the nations will be blessed. And so that is, it's a promise for all nations, and we have pretty much all nations coming to the shores of the United States of America. Despite the fact that we really have kind of put a shutdown on that, there's still, they access different ways through the media and the things that we produce digitally around the world. So we definitely have an influence on the nations, and it is a privilege. It is certainly a privilege in this generation to have that for this time. So I hope that our listeners will kind of take that comment and chew on that and wrestle with it and ask God to show them what that means for them, for those who are American citizens or from Australia or places that are also a position of privilege to invite and welcome. So I would love for you to say a little bit about, you talked about your own journey and your own family. And, unfortunately, when we look at the asylum situation kind of being shut down, like if your family was trying to get here today, that would most likely not be possible. And I know that you talked about just the gratitude that your family and so many immigrants have for that. So if there are those among us who are going to maybe reach out to a person and speak to power, maybe it's a senator that they're going to call or email, or maybe it's a way they're going to start praying and fasting, or it's something they're going to write up on a blog post or whatever they feel led to do. What are some of the words and phrases that you would encourage people to use as a reason that we want to advocate for immigrants?
Well, I think one of the things that I've learned is I'm a constituent in a place of power, whether it's, at the local level or federal level, state level, wherever you are, you have to remember you're a constituent, and you don't have to know all the numbers, and you don't have to have necessarily all of the right words, although sometimes that does help. What's really valuable is that you remind your representatives and their staff that you're a constituent and you do have a voice, and that they represent you actually. And then you just begin to tell your story. I care about this because, and you name a few reasons. And I have a neighbor who is this, and my family comes from this kind of heritage, or, I tutor a child who has this kind of background. One of my best friends, any story that really connects is a great way to speak to folks in power. And I think anytime that there's legislation that you want to address, then a little bit about the legislation. We would like for you to vote in such kind of way on this piece of legislation, or we think it's really important for you to consider and name that, whatever that thing is. And so I guess really in brief, Lori, I think really sharing our own story, why this matters to us, reminding legislators and staff and representatives that we're constituents. And I think it's good to say, if we can do this together, I would love to be able to, give you the support on social media. I mean, it's a bit of I don't want to say it's a bit of a game, but there is this sort of process that's an exchange. Yeah. That was loud. There is a bit of an exchange, I think, that we have to be aware of when we engage our politicians, and to say, we would really love to be able to show that you've demonstrated a care for the immigrants in our community. And if you come out in this way, we're happy to tweet about it, to, post it in our whatever social medias, or write an op-ed in our newspaper. So those things do matter, and they're important, but they're not the most important actually when a person is sitting in front of the mayor or the governor or whatever the case may be. It's here's my story. This really does matter to me. I've taken my time out to come and talk to you, and I would really love for you to hear and do whatever is within your power to make this a better place for our immigrant community.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's good. I would love if you have any stories of any immigrants that are people that you've heard of or know personally that you feel like are really capture what people need to know about immigrants. That if you would share maybe one of those, if one comes to mind.
Sure. Not quite a year ago, back in January of last year, I went to El Paso and spent some time on the other side of the border in Ciudad Juarez. And I met a gentleman, and his name is Carlos. And Carlos was coming from Guatemala, had made his trip north to the border, and was an asylum seeker. And his story, as is so common in those circumstances, is one wherein he was unsafe to stay at home. He had supported a political candidate that was unpopular, and the candidate's rival threatened his life, actually assaulted and harmed pretty badly his brother, and also he was protecting a little girl. He saw an interaction between that other person in power and a little girl, and he protected her.
Wow.
And so they came after him. And so he had to leave. And unfortunately, Carlos was leaving behind a wife and 2 sons.
Wow.
But it was either leave or die,
Wow.
and have more members of his family, their safety put in jeopardy. So he left and he came north to the border. He has a very, very slim chance of being able to be granted asylum.
Yeah.
But when I was there, he was still waiting for his court date, and his needs were, he wanted to be able to work, but he was a Guatemalan in Mexico, and so finding work actually is pretty tough to do.
Yeah.
When he got to the border, or along the way, he had injured his shoulder. So even some of that manual labor that you can sometimes find a day job or an odd job doing was especially difficult for him. His wife was pregnant when he left, and she had obviously a very, very hard time with the fact that he intervened to protect the life of a little girl. And because that meant that she basically lost him. And he said, if it was my own daughter, I would have wanted someone to step in.
Yeah.
And he told me, I found out actually after I left, I was still in touch with some folks who are in touch with him, that his wife was pregnant with a daughter. And so he was going to now have a daughter in his own family. And I don't know, Lori, this is the tragedy of our situation, of these stories that happen over and over and over again. What it will take. It's so dependent on the judges in particular situations, in particular counties. And what I would want for Carlos is a place for him and possibly his wife and 3 now children to come and have a place to work and a place to live that is safe. By my estimation, he only was doing good in the life of that little girl, in his own community. And then he has to put his own life on the line. It's so difficult to grapple with that reality. And I think that story again plays itself out 1,000 times over and over and over all across along our southern border. And I think that we have an obligation to say we can do better. We really can do better as a country, and begin to support laws that don't militarize our southern border, that would say, let's speed up a process so that we can get the Carloses through, so that they can come, so that they can work, they can contribute to our society, so that their children don't have to endure the same things that little girl was having to endure. So I think, I share Carlos's story because it's just one that's fairly recent and tragic. It's heartbreaking, and again is happening over and over and over. And I think that we could do better as a country.
Yeah, I agree. And it's heartbreaking because I know the situation, from what I understand, when it comes to Central Americans receiving a judge that would grant them a chance is just incredibly, incredibly slim from the immigration lawyers I've talked to. And so it really would take a miracle at this point for him. And yet, you know, as a citizen of this nation, I just find it shameful because we want a guy like him here, right? A noble man who's going to stand up for little girls. Like, don't we want a nation full of people like that? I certainly do. That would be a wonderful place to live. And so, yeah, I think all the more reason when we have a chance to help influence on a systemic level of a situation that Carlos has literally no voice and no power, no agency to ever change. But we get to be a voice for him because of our privilege and the way we are a constituent. I think it's a huge opportunity for us that we have a choice to make, right? We can look it straight in the face, understand it, break our heart along with the heart that's breaking, or we can turn the other way and pretend it's not happening. And we know which one is the right choice to make, I think. But it does get really complicated for a lot of people. So you've given us a real gift today just to make a lot of things that may not be clear for some to be very, very clear. And I think that's a real gift. I'd also love for you to talk about, you know, you have this new space that you're stepping into with Missio Alliance. And, you know, are there any ways that your organization is leading us in this area? And also any other resources you would point people toward to help them as they're thinking through these things and trying to find resources to give them that direction.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so I am still fairly new to the role of Missio Alliance. I started kind of late July. And one of my hopes is Missio has been around for almost a decade, 8 or 9 years. And there's a really beautiful, you know, work that has already been established there. And I think in this next season, what I hope to come along and do is bolster the work that already exists there in really engaging the cultural issues that happen to be of a systemic nature. So, you know, caring for immigrants, promoting racial justice, and actually also really bringing the voices of the global church to the ears of North American Christians, because we do have so much to learn, even if they're not immigrating to our country, which is a beautiful thing. We still have so much to learn from the global church. And again, I probably didn't mention this earlier, but I think we as Christians have the opportunity to be formed in new ways that we never would have otherwise been able to have by the immigrants that are coming to our country. Like, we get to understand the gospel and what it means to follow Jesus in new and really beautiful ways when we engage with the immigrant community. I think that's so often overlooked. So I wanted to just mention that since it was on my mind.
Yeah, that's good.
But in terms of Missio, anytime that immigration is a live conversation, you can expect to hear from one of our writers about it or hear from me about it, because that's a passion that I bring to the work, engaging systemic issues that particularly that make it harder for those who are on the margins, harder for the orphans, the widows, the strangers, and the poor, because those are the folks that God says, I'm just passionate about them. And then I think, did you ask me one other question? I feel like there was one other thing that
just
you asked
any
me
resources. Yeah. So Missio Alliance, but other ones. Yeah.
So one thing that's just been super, super helpful for me is a website called the Evangelical Immigration Table. So if folks in your audience specifically identify as evangelical, it's a wonderful resource. So look them up, Evangelical Immigration Table. So many resources. I have followed them for years. They've helped me on my own journey, really understand what does God have to say about loving immigrants, and then how do I do that in really practical ways, both sort of on an interpersonal level in my own community, as well as on the political level. So that's there's actually like bookmarks of 40 verses and 40 days of prayer for immigrants. And it's just all kinds of really great stuff on that site that I could point you to. And they will also have updates around any legislation. So, I think probably after the election, begin to stay tuned, especially to that site, for any political updates or things that are coming down the pike, either in the House or in the Senate.
That's good. Yes, I love them as well. And our mutual friend Alan Cross, yes. I had him on the podcast, and he's been heavily involved with the Evangelical Immigration Table. And I just totally agree with you. That's a great resource for people. So if that's new to any of you, please check it out. You'll find it very helpful, very informative. So I just want to say thank you for being on here today. I think you bring such a unique perspective. Not only just because your own family has a story of immigration, but also because you, as a leader in the faith community, are really stepping out there with a lot of risk and a lot of courage on behalf of those who can't speak in the same ways that you can. And I just really want to affirm that I see that you're really, that God is using you to change hearts and change lives. And I think that we're going to see more of that in the near future now that you're leading Missio Alliance. It's very exciting.
Thank you, Lori.
Thanks for being on here.
That's so kind. Thank you so much. It's, everybody, we just walk our journeys, right? We walk out our journeys faithfully. And I don't feel like, I'm so special, or I have this really like awesome, whatever. It certainly, sure, it's a privilege. But I just want to be faithful. I just want to be faithful. And so all of the ways that I get to do that in the big things and in the little things, that does bring so much joy.
Yes, I agree. And I just want to say blessings to you in the days and weeks ahead. I know Washington, D.C. can't be an easy place to live in a very polarized election season. But just thank you for the work that you do right there in our nation's capital, and just being such an influencer, and for even just using your voice today to speak to my listeners all around the world. And I hope that God uses the words that you have shared to give people just that courage to do that next step that God's asking them to do, to follow him in whatever way that is, especially in this area of immigration. So thanks, Lisa.
Thanks for having me today, Lori. It's a great privilege and joy to get to talk to you.
You too. Take care. Bye, Lisa.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.
Well, I know that Lisa has given us a ton to think about today. She has challenged us to steward our citizenship wherever we are, whether we're United States citizens, Australian citizens, whether we're from New Zealand or Singapore or anywhere in Europe and all over the world where we have immigrants coming to our borders and our shores, to really consider what it means to steward our citizenship. This is a privilege we have been given to live in the places where God has placed us. And if we live in a nation that is offering opportunities and situations to help people flourish in different ways, Lisa has certainly given us a lot to think about today. And also just some practical next steps of what it looks like to be an advocate for immigrants around us who don't have a voice, who don't have the opportunity to speak into the systems and the government where they're trying to make a better lives for themselves and their families. And not only that, but to contribute, as she said, to our economies and enrich our lives in the various ways where we get to learn so much from them. And I also hope you really paid attention to the phrases that she said around how much we have to learn from the global church. I think she's absolutely right, and 100% agree. And if you are someone who calls yourself a follower of Jesus and your understanding of Scripture and your understanding of the church has been exclusively driven from your own culture, I just want to invite you along with her invitation to open up your eyes and your ears to the way church is expressing itself around the world even today. I have been enriched so much from the Asian church, from the Latin American church, from even European and Australian and Kiwi friends that I've known in other countries around the world where I've lived, from African Christians. I have a special friend here in the Silicon Valley who just blesses me on a daily basis, and she's from Nigeria. Just the way that she reads the scriptures and sends prayers of blessing for me over text every single day. It's just really enriched my life. I encourage you, along with Lisa's encouragement, to just lean into that, to listen and to the voices of the global church and what they're teaching us about how to be people of faith and parts of our communities of faith, and what they're challenging us with right now. And if you are a person who doesn't have any faith at all, you just consider yourself maybe agnostic or atheist, you are certainly 100% welcome into this conversation to also listen to these voices of the global church if you would open your mind and heart to it. I think there's a lot we can learn no matter where we're from. I certainly have learned many things from my atheist friends, my agnostic friends, my Buddhist and Hindu and Muslim friends, things that have enriched my life and changed my opinions and changed my mindset on many things. And so I just hope that in this world, A World of Difference podcast, especially our immigration series, that we can begin to lean into the invitation that Lisa is giving us, just to listen better and to step into the lives of other people and what they walk through for a little while, and learn where the places are that we can advocate if we've been given privilege or agency to do so. And also just allowing people to enrich our lives with their stories and their courage and their resiliency and the way they've overcome so many obstacles in life, because we can all stand to have our hope and our faith encouraged right now. And I think that Lisa brings a really strong message in this area. I encourage you to follow her and the work that she's doing through Missio Alliance. This is an incredible organization that I've been following for many years, and just the work that they do is amazing, and she's really bringing a lot of leadership to the table, and we'll take it in some really great directions as well. So I encourage you to follow Missio Alliance and the things that they're putting out there for us to think through, and the invitation toward action that they are encouraging us in. And tune in next week, because we are going to have another incredible guest, my friend, and also the brother of my good friend, Chris Kennison. He is an immigration lawyer here in the United States, and he's going to speak to us about just the law and how things are going in terms of that side of things here in the United States, and the work that he does on behalf of immigrants coming into the United States and representing them as a lawyer. You're going to be really encouraged by both his heart and also the knowledge that he has, and just the firsthand information of what it's really like to be in the courtroom advocating for different immigrants who are just trying to get a fair hearing on their case, especially in the asylum cases that he's dealt with. And you're not going to want to miss that. So tune in next week to hear Chris Kennison talk about immigration law and all the information we can learn from what's going on in the United States right now. But he'll also bring a perspective of having grown up in Thailand and spent some time also in Cambodia. And so you will not want to miss those stories and how they formed his heart and his passion for what he does today. So tune in next week for Chris Kennison, and have a great week, guys. This podcast is dedicated to my friend Lisa Hoff. As I'm sending this podcast out to the world today, I just found out this morning that she passed away, and just a sudden illness after a surgery that she had. And she was just the kind of person that really just brought love and light everywhere she went. She had gone through countless immigration signs and countless airports. She had lived in China for many years, and most recently was living and teaching in Southern California. And I just wanted to dedicate this podcast to her. I know a lot of you listening are friends with Lisa, and even my guest on this show today, Lisa Rodriguez Watson, and Lisa Hoff and I were all getting our master's degrees at the same time, and her loss will be felt all around the world today. So this podcast, Lisa, is dedicated to you and to all those who have been mentored by you and learned from your life and your example of what it means to love our neighbors all around the world well. And you are certainly the kind of person who received immigrants well wherever you lived, and taught us how to do that with your own life, both with your brain and how you learned some really deep lessons throughout your life, but also the way you just dug in as a scholar into many areas of intercultural work, and then also just put that into practice by your kindness. And so this is dedicated to Lisa Hoff, and our prayers are certainly with her family and all of her friends tonight. As we're finishing this episode, if you're thinking, I really wish I could learn more or go a little bit deeper, well, that's what our Difference Maker community is for. I would love to welcome you in to join the rest of us there. Once again, it's only $5 a month to join, the price of a latte at your local coffee shop. You can join at our Changers tier. Difference Makers is a community that really means so much to me. It's very special because each time I have a guest on the show, I record something outside of what we give to just the regular podcast audience, where we go a little bit deeper, and then I post those video episodes in this community and we can discuss them. But also at the very beginning tier, which is our Changers tier of this community, you'll get exclusive voting power and help pick podcast topics that give us, more of what we want from your perspective. You'll have access to exclusive 30 plus mini-sodes that aren't out there for the general public. And you'll get every month an exclusive monthly bonus mini-sode. At our Groundbreakers level, which is $10 a month, you can join and get all of that, but also priority access to submit questions to the podcast. And you'll get an additional 2 exclusive monthly bonus mini-sodes. And at our Trailblazers tier, which is $15 a month, the price of 3 lattes a month, you can get all of that, plus also 3 exclusive monthly bonus minisodes, and a patron shout out. So I would love for you to join us at any of those tiers. It'll help you come into this community, be in the midst of all of us, other difference makers, and we'd love to hear your perspective. I certainly would. It's a place to engage more with me and the audience around what you like, what you're resonating with, and once again, go deeper with each of our guests. So please join us in this membership community. I would love to hear your perspective and love to share this extra content with you. So show up at patreon.com/a world of difference.